Continuing from the previous events, after the commotion during Aisha's trip, everything had been resolved, and once again, her longtime nemesis appeared. Moving forward with the story, Aisha was utterly surprised that Luminus, who usually had no interest in such matters, had followed her to the royal palace to be her friend. Although he had no desire to go there, because it was her destination, he decided to accompany her. Yet, instead of feeling happy, Aisha became pensive. Being an unmarried girl, just a few days out and bringing a man back home would surely cause a stir in her family. So, she had no choice but to explain that friendship doesn't always mean being romantically involved. As esteemed as the Spirit King might be, he was still clueless about human worldly matters, but his sincerity in wanting to be with Aisha was undeniable. He was willing to do anything just so they could be together. This made the 14-year-old girl's heart flutter, but as a princess, she could only receive him when he visited. Thus, Luminus decided to assume a human identity and come to see her. Thanks to the teleportation gates, their carriage quickly reached the palace. Upon hearing that her brother, Isis, had come personally to welcome her, Aisha hurriedly fixed her hair, her eyes glowing with excitement, leaving Luminus puzzled beside her. Seeing her immense joy when she mentioned her brother made him thoughtful. As soon as Aisha stepped out of the carriage, she heard the horse neigh, and sure enough, Isis arrived just in time to meet her. The two siblings, after days apart, immediately rushed toward each other and embraced tightly. It was clear that with a sister like Aisha, Isis no longer cared for his beloved horse, ordering it to be pulled away, breaking the poor animal's heart. However, Aisha was most concerned about the fact that Luminus was still in the carriage. If Isis entered, they would surely run into each other. After reassuring herself that no one could see Luminus, life took an unexpected turn when Isis suddenly stopped and questioned who this man was. The servants beside him were equally confused. Who was he talking to? Was he conversing with a ghost? In this kind of situation, Aisha knew that all she needed was a confident smile. She decided to play dumb and act like she didn't understand. But when she realized this strategy wasn't working, and her brother continued to focus on Luminus, she had no choice but to step in between them and promise an explanation. In the heat of the moment, Aisha hastily made up a name for Luminus, calling him Loon, a poor guy she had given a ride to. The atmosphere grew tense, leaving her flustered, fearing that if they were forbidden from seeing each other, she wouldn't be able to be friends with the Spirit King. To her surprise, the situation took a wild turn when Isis, in tears, assumed they had fallen in love at first sight and created a wildly absurd story in his head. Watching her brother making a fool of himself, Luminus could no longer hold back and intervened. He admitted to being Luminus, which startled both of them. However, instead of revealing that he was the Spirit King, he claimed to be a priest serving the god of light. The story started to sound believable, so Aisha decided to go along with it, embellishing the tale, saying that she had given him a ride because he wanted to visit the royal family. The three of them, now crammed into the small, crowded carriage, began the journey. Though Isis tried everything to kick him out, Luminus, with his thick skin, insisted on staying to talk more with the Saintess. This led to a heated exchange between them. Unable to endure any longer, Isis ordered the carriage to speed up to the temple, intending to get rid of him. Caught in the middle, Aisha felt awkward, stuck between a priest who seemed to have no sense of etiquette and a brother obsessed with his sister, being incredibly rude to the king of the light spirits. Finally, they arrived at the temple, and Aisha let out a sigh of relief. Sneaking a glance at the two men, she saw that Isis was still fuming with anger as he chased Luminus out of the carriage. As Luminus stepped out of the carriage, the bewildered coachman couldn't help but wonder where this man had come from. Trying to reassure herself that things would be fine, Aisha watched as Luminus confidently strode towards the temple. However, she was immediately interrupted by her brother's dramatic complaints about letting a stranger ride in the same carriage with her. In his opinion, if a man appeared, Aisha should have kept her distance. But Aisha could sense her brother's genuine concern for her, which made her feel a bit happy. She tried to ease Isis's worries, explaining that Luminus was a good person, so there was no need to be so anxious. But due to his overprotective nature, Isis demanded that she swear an oath to the god of light that she would never see that man again. However, the absurdity of swearing such an oath in front of the very person she was supposed to avoid, who was the god of light, left her speechless. Both parents were astonished when they saw the mountain of gifts Aisha brought back after just a few days away. This was Aisha's sweet revenge on their parents for overdoing her birthday celebrations. When she saw an imperial tea set, she immediately thought of her mother because its purple hue matched her mother's eyes. Without a second thought, she grabbed it without even checking the price. Naturally, these gifts were chosen by Aisha's three friends while they were at the market together. She excitedly told her family about her friends, each with their unique personality and charm, and even mentioned one she wanted to support and encourage, her face lighting up with joy. Seeing their usually reserved daughter now happily talking about her friends made the entire family feel incredibly relieved and proud of her. Of course, they had also heard about the incident in Blim, where someone else had been mistaken for the princess. They were aware of everything, both big and small, that happened, but they were particularly proud of how Aisha handled the situation. Even though her actions might have broken royal protocol, the family supported and praised her, as their priority was her safety. No sooner had she returned home than Aisha found herself busy preparing for the upcoming Midsummer Festival, where several priests had been invited. Hosting duties fell on Aisha. But when she looked at the guest list, she froze at the sight of the name Lune, the name she had given to Luminus. Before she could fully process the situation, Luminus suddenly appeared at her window, sending chills down her spine. This was the 3rd floor, for goodness sake. Couldn't he enter through the main door like normal people? More importantly, the servants were still in the room. If she spoke to the Spirit King, they would surely think she had lost her mind and was talking to herself. So, she discreetly dismissed them, though the maids' faces betrayed their suspicion. What strange antics was Aisha up to this time? Smiling calmly as she saw the maids off, Aisha immediately rushed to the window, flinging it open in shock. To her surprise, she forgot all royal decorum and bombarded Luminus with a string of questions from start to finish. This caught him off guard, but he found it amusing and even laughed. Only then did Aisha realize how rude she had been and quickly composed herself, inviting him inside with a formal bow. Seizing the moment, she asked if the name Lune on the guest list was indeed Luminus, now a priest. Luminus immediately admitted that he hadn't intended to take on the role, but after flexing his light powers just a little, the children had enthusiastically insisted on it. Aisha was baffled. There were no children in the palace except her, so who were these kids he was talking about? Luminus clarified, explaining that the children were elderly priests, their hair white and their teeth on the verge of falling out. Over the past few weeks, Luminus had respected Aisha's wish for human privacy, and now he had come to visit. For someone who had spent his life in solitude, the Spirit King had to adapt to human ways, which required more time than expected. Aisha seized the chance to apologize on behalf of her brother, Isis, but couldn't understand why Luminus had revealed his true identity at that moment. The question caused Luminus to pause as he set down his teacup. He explained that he couldn't hide his curiosity about someone so important to Aisha, which left her stunned. How could a proud king like him be interested in someone like her? Her cheeks turned bright red as she realized she had unknowingly fallen for him. Ru, who had just woken up, saw his king sitting there and immediately flew over, bombarding him with questions, just as Aisha had earlier. This gave Luminus the perfect opportunity to tease Aisha, pointing out how alike she and Ru were. Flustered, Aisha blushed even more, embarrassed by her impulsive behavior. After some clarification, Aisha learned a shocking truth. The dreams she'd been having weren't caused by Luminus. They could be omens, triggered by the resonance between her energy and his. While it was impossible to say for certain, it was already extraordinary enough that she could see spirits with her naked eyes, something unheard of before. Luminus had no prior knowledge of the situation, though he had heard stories long ago. But seeing the expectant look on Aisha's face, practically screaming "spill the tea," made him chuckle. He then resorted to his usual teasing, stopping the story halfway to pique her interest, only to leave it unfinished. Just as Aisha was about to protest, she suddenly heard a familiar voice. It was none other than Isis outside with the maids. Not only was Aisha startled, but Luminus also realized what was happening and prepared to leave. Being the Spirit King, Luminus' aura of light was incredibly powerful. Even without showing himself, anyone with spiritual sensitivity could sense his presence. Aisha, not wanting a repeat of their last confrontation, hurried to usher him out. In a moment of perfect timing, as soon as Luminus disappeared, Isis walked in. Aisha thought she had narrowly avoided disaster, but Isis, being as sharp as ever, immediately noticed something amiss. There were 2 teacups in the room, but only Aisha was present. Thankfully, she was quick-witted and blamed it on playing with Ru. The little spirit eagerly nodded in agreement. As Aisha nervously sweated under Isis's scrutiny, he eventually seemed convinced and sighed with relief. Raising a younger sister is like holding a delicate porcelain vase, always fearing it might shatter at any moment. Isis had come because the Emperor and Empress were looking for Aisha. He wore a mysterious expression, hinting that the upcoming festival would bring a surprise that she'd love. Naturally, Aisha's pleading puppy dog eyes almost melted Isis's heart, but he managed to resist. It turned out that what Isis had been keeping secret was the announcement of Aisha's debut to the public, which would coincide with the Midsummer Festival. This made Aisha incredibly happy. In her previous life, she'd never had a party of her own, let alone a debut. However, the Emperor wanted to hear her thoughts, fearing the event might be too overwhelming for his little girl, as this debut wasn't just a celebration, it was a declaration to the aristocracy. Though it was a bit daunting, Aisha was excited. This would be her only debut. On top of that, there would be a blessing from a high-ranking priest. Initially, the emperor had intended to ask the high priest to perform the blessing, but the old man felt he was too advanced in years for the task. Instead, he recommended someone even more prestigious. Being blessed by a priest of light was incredibly important, as the higher one's status, the more esteemed the priest had to be. But who could have predicted that the person performing the blessing would be none other than Luminus, the king of the light spirits himself? This was something soul mages could only dream of, and naturally, it made Aisha so happy that her joy was written all over her face. Seeing their daughter's beaming expression left both Isis and the emperor frozen in place. Even the empress shared their sentiment, already imagining their precious girl being stolen away by some boy in the future. But for now, everyone was focused on the big day, each one competing to outdo the others in preparing Aisha's dress. Watching the scene unfold, Aisha felt deeply loved, though Ru, who knew her better than anyone, also wanted to help plan her outfit. After dinner, Isis escorted Aisha back to the princess's chambers, having something important to discuss. There was nothing more pressing than the appearance of a holy relic originating from Hindenburg. Unlike Edmir, where holy relics were strictly controlled, in the Hindenburg Empire, these items were secretly circulated like everyday magical tools. Even in the south, the teachers invited to instruct on summoning spirits were from Hindenburg. Just hearing this made Aisha pensive. She had been uneasy ever since their last journey together after returning from her trip. Sensing her hesitation, Isis had quickly dismissed the servants earlier. Alone together, Aisha finally revealed the truth to him, asking for his help. After hearing the whole story, Isis was in disbelief. Who in their right mind would give such a dangerous item to a young girl who hadn't even had her debut yet? There was no way the negative emotions accumulating around the girl could lead to anything good. Aisha couldn't shake her suspicions that this incident was somehow connected to Hindenburg. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Isis vowed to investigate the truth behind the bracelet. However, for now, everything was just speculation. They needed solid proof to accuse the treacherous empire. And the only person who could help them achieve that was Ashley. Aisha was determined to invite her to the upcoming party to finally resolve everything. With the reasoning that attending the debut would help avoid raising suspicions, Aisha was determined to keep the matter under wraps, not wanting to expose the incident to the public. Naturally, Isis, who knew his younger sister well, understood that she didn't want Ashley held accountable for illegally using a forbidden holy relic. After all, the girl was only 13, far too young to have her future destroyed. Moreover, Aisha wanted Hindenburg to lower its guard. The peace treaty between their two countries had already been shattered due to the recent poisoning incident, but relations were still maintained because Aisha was biding her time, waiting for the right moment to strike at their weak spots. Aisha's thoughtful expression as she pondered over the situation made Isis reflect. He often felt like his younger sister had an air of maturity that was far too advanced for a 14-year-old. Of course, for Aisha, this was normal since she had lived through 2 lifetimes. But in her previous life, Aisha's time had also ended at 14. That's why Isis longed for her to reach 15 and live a peaceful life. When their eyes met, Aisha began to suspect that Isis was hiding something from her. She was sure it wasn't just about the holy relic, but he chose to stay silent, hiding behind a smile. Watching her brother leave, Aisha felt a growing sense of unease. Although he was the person who knew her best, he was also the one she understood the most, and this secrecy made her nervous. In the following days, Luminus often visited Aisha, treating her home like his own. Because she frequently dismissed the servants, it sparked a scandalous rumor. Looking out the window with sparkling eyes, as if waiting for something exciting. People speculated that Aisha had entered the moody teenage phase. When she walked into the room, everyone pretended to be busy, but of course, Aisha wasn't fooled and wanted to know what they were gossiping about. One of the maids asked if she wanted to be alone today, but Aisha had no idea when Luminus would show up. He never gave her advance notice. The maids then went back and forth discussing her coming of age, leaving Aisha utterly confused. When she finally heard that they were talking about her supposed teenage phase, Aisha was shocked. Even though she firmly denied it, the maids' faces clearly showed they didn't believe her. The ground wasn't shaking from an earthquake, it was the footsteps of more people rushing in to find her. It turned out they had heard the rumors about her reaching adolescence and came to confirm it. Seeing her parents, teary-eyed and lamenting how their daughter was growing up, left Aisha trembling with frustration. Desperate for an ally, she foolishly asked one of the maids for support, only to discover that she shared the same thoughts but had kept quiet about it. Aisha could only sigh in exasperation. With the event fast approaching, Aisha was busy trying on dresses. But since she was so beautiful, every dress seemed to suit her, sparking a heated debate between her two maids. As their argument showed no signs of stopping, they tried to push the decision onto Aisha, leaving her at a loss for words. In the end, after trying on countless outfits, she decided to take a break, finally putting an end to their endless bickering. The maids immediately brought her tea, along with letters from various ladies. Receiving mail from others made her excited, and she eagerly opened it. Holding the red envelope, she instantly recognized it. It was unmistakably from Rose. Just from the handwriting, Aisha could picture her friend's lively and wild personality, and she couldn't help but laugh. After reading Rose's letter, she opened a blue envelope, which had a completely different feel, neat. This letter reflected the maturity and poise of her friend, who was the only one in their group of 4 who had already made her debut. It was filled with useful advice. Finally, there was a letter from Ashley. The girl had been doing much better since then, though still somewhat scared of her mother. With the water spirit by her side, she had been improving day by day. In her letter, Ashley mentioned the upcoming event and expressed a desire to discuss it further with Aisha when they met. Family, friends, and spirits, all of them were involved in making this the most special party of Aisha's life. Their presence, along with that of Luminus, the king of the light spirits, often seen as a god of light, would not only elevate the event but also help draw Hindenburg's attention. However, that meant Aisha couldn't let her guard down at the party. As she was contemplating this, the two maids barged in again, urging her to try on more dresses, causing her to choke on her tea. Before the festival, they welcomed the representative from the temple to discuss the blessing ceremony for Aisha's debut. In an unexpected twist, the candidate for high priest was none other than Luminus, who was also sitting there under a fake name. True to form, he radiated like a beacon. However, despite everyone's concerns that he might be disrespectful to the emperor, Luminus, for some reason, was suddenly well behaved. Whether he had taken a crash course in etiquette or was being possessed by a saint, his humble and polite demeanor had everyone heaving a sigh of relief. Aisha, catching his eye, shared a knowing smile with the priest, leaving the empress utterly confused. Seeing Luminus looking at her with such deep intent, Aisha's heart stirred. She could only pretend not to know him, while outwardly maintaining her professional demeanor. At last, the stubborn man cooperated. Despite this, Aisha couldn't help but wonder what force had transformed him, from someone who used to speak so rudely and mockingly, with no regard for proper speech, to now acting so professionally. The high priest confidently introduced Luminus as the one who would soon become the grand priest, making him the perfect candidate to bless the princess. After completing the planning for the summer solstice festival, the 4 of them left the palace. The atmosphere between the two men grew cold. Isis, still bitter from their previous encounter, kept glaring at him. As he suspected, this man had an unusual aura. Who would have thought he'd be a top candidate for the grand priest position? Yet his demeanor now was completely different from when he spoke with the emperor earlier. Luminus had reverted to his old rude ways, provoking Isis to the point of frustration as he tried to assert his status as crown prince. However, no matter how hard he tried, Luminus remained unimpressed. Eventually, Isis gave up, realizing it wasn't worth humiliating himself further. Watching them bicker like cats and dogs, Aisha was left speechless. The high priest, watching the scene unfold, felt as though his life's work was fulfilled. After a lifetime of serving the gods, he could finally witness his deity in person, all thanks to Aisha's presence. He looked at her with gentle eyes and a warm smile, like a grandfather looking at his beloved grandchild. Once just a small princess, now she had grown so much. He wished he could stay by her side longer to watch her mature, but now that he was approaching old age, he had to pass the position of grand priest to someone else. He offered his best wishes for her upcoming debut. That night, Aisha worked late, diligently preparing for the summer solstice, but exhaustion soon set in, and she began to nod off. Just as her face was about to hit the table, Luminus appeared out of nowhere, gently catching her forehead. Startled, she gave an embarrassed laugh. The real question was why he had snuck into her room in the middle of the night. But he nonchalantly explained that he had noticed her light was still on and thought he'd drop by for a chat. Aisha, used to his antics, didn't bother to react and let him be. What intrigued her more was how Luminus had managed to master human honorifics when speaking to the emperor. It was thanks to his daily conversations with Aisha that he gained a better understanding of humans and how to adapt to them. What puzzled Luminus, however, was seeing how many important people were in Aisha's life. From her brother Isis to the elderly high priest, everyone seemed to care deeply for her. Despite the high priest being nearly 90 years old, Luminus referred to him as the child, which caught Aisha off guard. But she couldn't deny that all of them, family, the high priest, even the maids, played a crucial role in her life. Without them, she wouldn't have been able to escape the darkness and become who she is today. Suddenly, Luminus made a jarring comment, revealing that he could see the shadows that still lingered in Aisha's heart. Startled, she didn't know how to respond, only managing a crooked, awkward smile. Sensing her discomfort, Luminus quickly decided to leave, but not before lightly tapping her forehead with his finger, causing it to glow as a gesture of good night. Once he left, Aisha slumped over her desk, exhausted. The next morning, Aisha felt incredibly refreshed. Thanks to Luminous' spell, she had enjoyed a restful sleep, and her energy was fully restored. Even Rue was in a heightened state of excitement. Still, the previous night had left her shaken. Who would have thought Luminous possessed such a power? She reassured herself that there was no way he knew about her past life. But now, she found herself caught up in the endless battle between her maids as they forced her to choose the perfect dress, leaving her weary and overwhelmed. Staring at the 3 dresses in front of her, she couldn't make a decision, causing the tailor to grow anxious, fearing that none of the dresses had pleased the princess. Finally, her nanny came up with a solution: leave the decision to the empress. The moment they arrived at the empress's chamber, Aisha was immediately captivated by a sparkling white gown, her face lighting up with pure delight. Seeing Aisha's fascination with the dress, the empress proudly explained that this was the very gown she had worn for her debut. Like her daughter, she had also been presented to society at the age of 14. Despite the dress being over 20 years old, it had not lost its brilliance and still appeared as vibrant as ever. Due to the festive atmosphere, the empress had felt nostalgic and had taken the gown out to reminisce about her past. Hearing this, Aisha grew even more excited and eagerly asked her mother to share the story of that time, her face lighting up with joy. The empress began her tale, recalling that the northern region was cold during her 14th summer, which is why the debut was held during that season to allow more guests to attend. However, on the day of the event, a heavy rainstorm hit, and her escort had fallen from his horse and couldn't make it. For a young girl, the debut was an important milestone, and with no guests and no escort, the empress had felt deeply saddened, her tears falling uncontrollably. It was then that a golden-haired prince on a white horse came to her aid. That was the first time she met the emperor, who, feeling sympathy for the lonely girl, agreed to be her escort. What had seemed like the worst day turned out to be the beginning of something beautiful. Aisha immediately assumed this was where her parents' love story began, but in reality, the empress hadn't dared to dream of marrying the emperor at the time, as he was already the crown prince. It was simply an unforgettable memory. She lamented that the gown had only been worn once. Hearing this, Aisha mischievously came up with a bold idea. The maids, dismayed that their chosen dresses had been rejected, couldn't deny that the empress's gown looked strangely perfect on Aisha. Finally, the day of the summer solstice festival arrived. That morning, Aisha was busy greeting the high priest as part of her duties as the holy maiden. This was a significant ceremony as it symbolized the bond between the royal family and the temple. After bidding farewell to Luminus, she quickly returned to her room to prepare. However, after being draped in layers of diamonds and jewels, Aisha felt so weighed down that she could barely lift her head. Just then, she heard a knock at the door. It was Vian, there to escort her to the banquet. His usual professional demeanor faltered, leaving Aisha puzzled. It turned out that Vian, upon seeing his childhood friend transformed into such a beautiful young woman, was flustered. Though initially awkward, Vian quickly regained his composure. Aisha, on the other hand, became self-conscious, as this was the first time Vian had complimented her appearance. When he noticed her rubbing her neck, he realized it was because the heavy jewelry was making her uncomfortable. Apologizing for the intrusion, Vian gently lifted her hair and cast a spell to make the jewelry lighter. As she smiled brightly, thanking him, Vian was so startled by how close her face was to his that he stepped back and bumped into the wall. He thought to himself, that was a close one. When they stepped outside, the gathering of priests was already in full swing. Once Aisha was ready, she signaled to the attendant to open the doors. The announcement echoed through the hall: the sole star of the empire, Princess Aisha, has arrived. As she and Luminus entered the room together, the crowd erupted in murmurs, enchanted by Aisha's beauty and grace, despite her being only 14 years old. At the same time, discussions about the new pope candidate, Luminus, intensified among the people. Upon seeing her, the emperor immediately recognized the gown and asked the empress to confirm that it was indeed the same one from that fateful day. The empress, pleasantly surprised that the emperor remembered their first meeting, proudly shared that it had been Aisha's idea to wear the dress for her debut. Initially, the empress had wanted to refuse, thinking the gown was too old-fashioned and outdated. Moreover, she believed Aisha deserved a dress of her own for such an important event. But Aisha insisted, explaining that the dress held joyful memories of her mother. Moved by her daughter's words, the empress decided to give the gown to her as a gift, as it represented the special moment when she and the emperor first met. She hoped that by wearing it, Aisha would also find happiness. Both parents watched as their daughter approached, looking more grown-up than ever. They felt an overwhelming sense of pride as she greeted them with a calm and professional demeanor, showing no signs of nervousness. After a brief introduction and bestowing the formal blessings, the summer solstice festival finally began. Under the watchful eyes of everyone present, Aisha prepared to receive Luminus' blessing. As he extended his hand, the entire room filled with light. A radiant golden orb appeared, signifying his blessing upon Aisha, the sole holy maiden of the Elmer Empire. Instantly, her entire body was enveloped in the warm, golden glow, a blessing from the Spirit King himself. Not stopping at just blessing Aisha, Luminus extended his blessings to the devoted citizens who worshipped him like a deity. Everyone present was left in awe of this miraculous display of power. Once the ceremony concluded, Luminus helped Aisha to her feet, signaling the start of the dancing portion of the event. Due to her many responsibilities, the Empress had forgotten to arrange a dance partner for her daughter, so she quickly glanced at the impressive high priest, thinking it might be a good opportunity to match them up. However, before Luminus could respond, Isis stepped in immediately, asserting that he was the only suitable partner for his sister. Aisha, grateful for the timely intervention, happily went along with it, choosing Isis as her first dance partner. As the soothing music began to play, the two siblings danced as if they were playing together. Watching his little sister grow up and soon become a refined lady, Isis couldn't help but feel anxious about the day he would no longer be by her side. However, despite his worries, he wore the happiest smile, knowing that Aisha was at her most joyful when she was with him. Yet, unlike their usual playful banter, when Aisha asked if they would always be together, Isis fell silent. Just as Aisha was waiting for his response, the music abruptly stopped, and the two separated. Before Aisha could hear his answer, Isis, once again acting on impulse, handed her off to Vian to keep her safe from the eager crowd of men surrounding her. Seeing Aisha's face, Vian immediately began to question his close friend, who gave him a thumbs up from across the room. Although a bit embarrassed, Vian summoned his courage to take Aisha's hand, especially since she looked so sweet. He had been confident earlier, thinking he knew the traditional imperial dance, but the moment they started, he fumbled the steps completely, making Aisha burst into laughter, clutching her stomach from the hilarity. It turned out that Vian wasn't as competent as she had always believed. Her radiant smile made Vian's heart skip a beat. By the time the dance ended, both were utterly exhausted, not only from the missteps but also from the countless times Vian had stepped on her feet. Suddenly, Luminus appeared, glowing brightly, and asked Aisha for a dance. Seeing this, Isis was momentarily petrified, realizing he had let his guard down and someone had stolen his precious gem. Unlike the stiff knight earlier, Luminus and the other spirits were graceful and adept at dancing. What caught Aisha off guard was when Luminus mentioned that he wasn't fond of her calling him by his real name and preferred Lune, the name she had given him. Taking advantage of the moment, he pulled her close by her slim waist and reminded her that in the human world, he was Lune, as that was the name she had bestowed upon him. Aisha, delighted, allowed herself to fully enjoy the dance. After the dance concluded, Aisha hurried off to find Isis. She had seen him watching her intently while she danced with Luminus. But as she moved through the crowd, she caught a glimpse of Luminus being swarmed by admirers, though she chose to ignore it and continued her search for her brother. Leaving Luminus to fend off the crowd, Aisha finally spotted her three friends, who had just arrived at the event. The four of them quickly gathered to catch up and talk like old friends. Rose, with a mischievous grin, revealed that Ashley had been frequently gazing at the brooch Aisha had gifted her, unable to forget her. Yet, it wasn't just Ashley, Rose herself was also clearly smitten, and Aisha couldn't help but give her a knowing look as if she could see through everything. Having skipped meals since the morning to fit into their best dresses, the girls' stomachs were growling in protest. Soon, they were happily devouring the feast prepared at the palace. Ashley's progress with summoning spirits was going well, and Aisha offered to lend her some of the books she had studied. Since the disappearance of spirit sorcerers, such books have become incredibly rare. The sacred relic that Ashley had received earlier had been given to her by someone at the academy. When she mentioned her teacher, her face tensed up as she hesitated to recount the events of that day. Ashley had been surprised to find that her teacher was a young woman, who had shown great interest in Ashley's platinum hair and seemed quite pleased with it. Though the sudden touch startled her, Ashley was overjoyed at the prospect of becoming a spirit sorcerer and confided her deepest wish, to be acknowledged by her mother. The teacher had noticed the bruises on Ashley's wrists and had given her a faint smile before presenting the sacred relic. When the moonlight reflected off it, there was no mistaking who it was, Marianne, her eyes glowing red. However, the moment she touched the bracelet, Ashley's eyes darkened, and she snapped out of her trance. When she looked up, the mysterious figure was gone, leaving only a space with the wind blowing in through the window. After confirming that the person was indeed a young woman with white hair and red eyes, Aisha was left frozen in shock. Thankfully, Ashley's voice woke her from her daze, allowing her to think more clearly. What followed was the arrival of their professor, the one who had been teaching them to become sorcerers. But when the professor saw the sacred relic bracelet, she became frantic, muttering that the necessary materials had been gathered. Upon hearing this, Aisha recalled what Luminus had mentioned before, the negative emotions of children. Although her hands clenched in anger, Aisha maintained her composure, deciding to take Ashley to the royal library to find more study materials. As soon as they entered the library, Ashley was awestruck by the vast collection of books. Aisha quickly grabbed a book she had previously studied and began flipping through it. Suddenly, she stopped. One page discussed how summoning demons and using dark magic involved harnessing negative emotions as materials. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, the ease with which sacred relics could be acquired, the negative energy, and the red eyes she had seen in the prison, Aisha realized without a doubt that the culprit was Marianne. She was not just a sorceress, but a dark sorceress. The red eyes were not of a spirit but of a demon. Just thinking about it made Aisha clench her teeth in fury. Seeing Aisha's exhausted and dazed expression, Ashley quickly noticed and touched her trembling hands, surprising Aisha. When Ashley suddenly withdrew, thinking she had been disrespectful to the princess, Aisha immediately held onto her hands, leaning against Ashley to calm down, feeling the warmth of her touch. After gathering the necessary books, the two left the library. Aisha, unable to hide the happiness on her face, was grateful to have such a sweet friend. They soon rejoined the others and chatted excitedly. Knowing that Ashley was improving every day, they all encouraged her, confident that at this rate, she would soon be able to meet the water spirit again. As they were happily chatting away, Aisha suddenly heard a familiar voice coming from a nearby room, sparking her curiosity. Though she felt she recognized it, Ashley urged her to let it go. It turned out to be Isis, discussing important matters about the looming threat to Rio 10. The one behind the chaos was none other than Inderberg. Isis was concerned, as this situation would undoubtedly lead to war. A year earlier, Crown Prince Rakis had ascended the throne with the support of Saint Marianne, but pressure from the nobles had forced him to distract them by expanding the kingdom's territory. Rio 10 was their first target, not only due to its advantageous location but also because of its military prowess. Isis knew that once they conquered Rio 10, their next move would be to march on Elmer. This made him furious, clenching his teeth in anger. He saw this as a perfect opportunity to exact revenge for Aisha. But when he remembered the image of his sister, happily wishing for them to stay together forever, he couldn't help but clench his fists even tighter. He had promised to protect her dream, so he ordered Vian to start preparing their forces to strike back. While they were discussing their strategy, they suddenly heard a noise outside and immediately grew cautious, ready to draw their swords. Isis, however, signaled them to hold off, not wanting to alert the intruder. He cautiously approached to find out who dared to eavesdrop. And so, today's chapter ends. Stay tuned for the next part. Peace.